I've lived in this neighborhood for as long as I can remember. It's the kind of place where nothing much happens, and that's just the way we like it. Everyone knows everyone, and there's a comforting predictability to the daily routine. Mr. Jenkins, our elderly neighbor, was always part of that routine. He lived alone in the old, rundown house at the end of the street, a place that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to anyone, and aside from the occasional nod of acknowledgement, he mostly went unnoticed. We all just assumed he was a harmless old man, maybe a little lonely, but certainly not someone to be concerned about. But this Halloween, something felt off. It started as a normal evening, with kids in their costumes running from house to house, the sounds of laughter and excitement filling the air. I was watching from my window, enjoying the sight of the kids having fun, when I noticed Mr. Jenkins standing outside his house. At first, it seemed like he was just watching the kids like the rest of us, but there was something about the way he was staring. It wasn't just casual observation, it was intense, almost predatory. He stood there, completely still, his eyes tracking the children as they moved from house to house. His expression was strange. It was a mix of concentration and something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it made me uneasy. As I watched, I saw a group of kids approach his house, hesitating before stepping onto his porch. I could almost feel their apprehension from where I stood. Later that night, I overheard some of the kids talking as they made their way back home. They were whispering about Mr. Jenkins, about how creepy he was. One of them, a little boy dressed as a pirate, said Mr. Jenkins had grabbed his arm when he reached out for candy. He said Jenkins leaned in close and whispered something he couldn't understand, his grip tightening around the boy's wrist until he managed to pull away. The boy's eyes were wide with fear as he told the story, and I could see that it wasn't just a Halloween prank. He was genuinely scared. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Mr. Jenkins had always been a bit of a recluse, but this was different. There was something sinister in the way he had looked at those kids, something that made my skin crawl. I found myself watching his house more closely, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind those faded walls. As the night wore on, the festive atmosphere of Halloween began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The usual laughter and chatter of children running through the streets were slowly replaced by the worried murmurs of parents. I could hear them calling out names, their voices rising in pitch with each unanswered call. It didn't take long for word to spread. Several kids hadn't returned home yet. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just kids being kids, losing track of time in the excitement of the night. But as more and more parents started gathering on the street, their faces pale with fear, I knew something was very wrong. The air seemed to thicken with tension, the kind that creeps up on you, making the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that the strange behavior I'd witnessed earlier had something to do with this. My thoughts kept circling back to Mr. Jenkins. That disturbing stare, the way he seemed to fixate on the children, it all felt too coincidental. As the panic in the neighborhood grew, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I was going to confront him. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was some gut instinct, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion that Mr. Jenkins knew more than he was letting on. I approached his house cautiously, the ominous creaking of the old wooden porch echoing through the silent night. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The curtains in one of the windows twitched, as if someone had just pulled them back slightly to peek outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear any sound from within the house. That's when I heard it, a faint, muffled noise, almost like a cry, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. It was so faint that at first, I thought I might be imagining it. But as I stood there, the sound came again, a bit clearer this time. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement. Panic surged through me, but so did a desperate need to know what was happening. I stepped off the porch and began to circle the house, my eyes scanning the ground for any clues. That's when I saw it. Half hidden in the overgrown grass near the back of the house, there was something small and colorful. I knelt down and picked it up, my hands trembling as I realized what I was holding. It was a piece of a child's Halloween costume, torn and dirty. A wave of nausea hit me as the reality of the situation started to sink in. The missing children, they had to be inside. But the house was eerily quiet, the windows dark and uninviting. I knew I should call the police, but something compelled me to try and get inside, to see for myself what was going on. I went back to the front door, trying the handle, but it was locked tight. I pounded on the door, calling out for Mr. Jenkins, but there was no response, just the heavy silence pressing in on me from all sides. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart, growing louder with each passing second. And then, from somewhere inside, I heard that muffled cry again, barely audible, but unmistakably real. My dread was now full-blown terror, and I knew I had to find a way in before it was too late. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but something inside me snapped. The cries, the costume piece, it all pointed to something terrible happening inside that house. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. Those kids, they were in there. They needed help. I circled back to the rear of the house, looking for any way to get inside. My breath caught in my throat when I spotted a small window leading to the basement, its glass cracked and grimy. I hesitated for just a moment before using a rock to shatter the remaining glass, the sound echoing through the still night. I reached in, unlocking the latch, and slowly pried the window open. The opening was narrow, but I managed to squeeze through, landing awkwardly on the cold, hard floor below. The air inside was thick with an overpowering stench that hit me like a physical force. It was a rancid mix of mold, decay, and something far worse, something that made my stomach churn. I could barely see, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the broken window. As I stumbled through the cluttered rooms, I had to choke back the rising bile in my throat, the smell becoming almost unbearable the closer I got to the basement door. With each step, the floor creaked beneath me, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing down, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The strange noises I'd heard earlier were louder now, a mixture of muffled cries and the creak of something heavy shifting in the darkness. My hand trembled as I reached for the basement door, my fingers brushing against the cold, rusted metal of the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a long, drawn-out creak, revealing a steep, rickety staircase descending into pitch blackness. I fumbled for my phone, using the weak light to guide my way down, each step groaning under my weight. As I descended, the smell intensified, and my fear reached a fever pitch. The noises were coming from just below, and with every fiber of my being, I knew I was about to see something I could never unsee. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, my phone's light caught something that made my blood freeze. There, in the center of the room, was a large, dusty table surrounded by child-sized mannequins. They were all dressed in the same Halloween costumes that the missing children had been wearing, their plastic eyes staring blankly into the void. My mind raced to rationalize what I was seeing, to tell myself that they were just mannequins, props for some twisted prank. But as I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. One of the figures shifted ever so slightly, its chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. I aimed the light directly at it, and that's when the horrifying truth hit me with the force of a freight train. These weren't mannequins at all. They were the missing children, drugged or restrained, posed like lifeless dolls in some grotesque display. Panic surged through me, my body screaming at me to run, to get out of that house before it was too late. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I turned and bolted up the stairs, my only thought to get out, to escape the nightmare I had just uncovered. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my hands were shaking so violently that it was a struggle to open the door. When I finally burst out into the cold night air, I screamed for help, my voice raw and desperate. The neighbors came running, and soon the police arrived, storming the house with weapons drawn. I stood there in the street, numb and shaking, as they dragged Mr. Jenkins out in handcuffs, his face a twisted mask of calm that sent a shiver down my spine. The truth of what he had done, the twisted life he had been living right under our noses, was more than any of us could comprehend. The entire neighborhood was in shock, reeling from the discovery that the kindly old man we had all dismissed as harmless was actually a monster in disguise. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the image of those poor children from my mind, their terrified faces haunting my every thought. I kept asking myself how we had missed the signs, how the true horror had been hiding in plain sight, masked by the familiar facade of an old, lonely man. Halloween used to be my favorite time of year. There was something about the crisp autumn air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the way the whole town seemed to come alive with excitement. But now, Halloween is a time of dread, a time when parents keep their children close, and everyone's eyes are wide with fear. It's been like this for as long as I can remember, but no one really talks about it. No one talks about the missing children. You see, our town has a dark tradition, one that's been going on for decades. Every few years, on Halloween night, a child goes missing, vanishes without a trace. It doesn't happen every year, but when it does, it's like a cold shadow passes over the town, and everyone knows it could happen again. The disappearances are always the same. A kid goes out trick-or-treating, full of excitement and energy, and then nothing. No one sees them again. It's as if they've been swallowed by the night. The thing is, we've all tried to make sense of it, but there's never been a pattern, no clues that could point to what's really happening. The police always search, combing through the town, the woods, and every abandoned building, but they never find anything. Just an empty costume here, or a forgotten candy bag there. It's like the children are erased, leaving behind only a growing sense of fear. Every Halloween, as the decorations go up and the kids start planning their costumes, there's an unspoken tension in the air. We all pretend it's just another holiday, but deep down, we know better. The laughter and excitement are tinged with nervousness, the kind that makes you look over your shoulder, even when you know you're being silly. It's the kind of dread that sticks with you, no matter how hard you try to ignore it. For me, it's personal. A few years ago, my younger brother, Tommy, went missing on Halloween night. I was the last one to see him. I remember the way he looked in his little pirate costume, all excited to go out with his friends. I was supposed to be watching him, but I got distracted, just for a moment. When I turned back, he was gone. The memory haunts me every day, and every Halloween, that guilt comes crashing back, stronger than ever. That's why I can't let it go. I can't just sit back and pretend that it's not happening, like so many others in this town do. I have to know what happened to Tommy and to all the other kids who never came home. That's why this year, I'm going to dig deeper. I'm going to find out the truth, no matter what it takes. Because someone or something is out there, and it's not going to stop until we do something about it. Determined to find out what really happened to Tommy, I began digging into the town's history, searching for anything that could explain the disappearances. I figured that if I couldn't find answers in the present, maybe the past held the key. It wasn't easy. Most people didn't want to talk about it. Even bringing up the missing children would get you nothing but nervous glances and hurried excuses. But I wasn't about to let that stop me. It was during one of my late-night visits to the town's dusty old library that I stumbled upon something. Buried in the back of an old, forgotten book was a story, more like a legend, really, that had been passed down through generations. It was the kind of tale that parents told their children to keep them from wandering off at night, a story meant to scare, but with an uncomfortable edge of truth. The legend spoke of shadowy figures that emerged on Halloween night, spirits or entities that thrived on fear and innocence. They were said to be drawn to the energy of the night, to the thrill and excitement that Halloween brought out in children. According to the story, these figures would lure children away with promises of candy and adventure, leading them into the darkness, where they would never be seen again. At first, I didn't want to believe it. It sounded too much like a ghost story, something out of a campfire tale meant to frighten kids. But the more I read, the more I realized that the details matched up with what had been happening in our town. The timing, the way the children vanished without a trace, it all fit. The legend wasn't just a story, it was a warning, passed down through the years by those who knew the truth, but were too afraid to speak it aloud. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing things I found. There were old newspaper clippings about strange symbols that had been found near the sites where children went missing, symbols that no one could explain. They were always dismissed as the work of pranksters, but there were too many similarities for it to be a coincidence. The same symbols, over and over again, like a signature left behind by something that wanted to be known, but not understood. Then there were the whispered warnings. People would speak in hushed tones about sightings of dark, cloaked figures in the days leading up to Halloween. They were always at the edge of your vision, disappearing the moment you tried to get a better look. It was as if they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Some said they had seen these figures near the places where the children were last seen, but no one had ever been able to describe them in detail. They were shadows, nothing more, until it was too late. Each clue I uncovered only deepened my dread, but it also pulled me closer to the heart of the mystery. I began to piece together the fragments of a dark ritual, something ancient and sinister, tied to the very foundation of our town. It seemed that the disappearances were not random at all, but part of a twisted cycle that repeated itself every few years. The figures in the shadows weren't just legends, they were real, and they had been here all along, hiding in plain sight. The final revelation hit me like a cold wave. These entities, whatever they were, had been feeding off our town's children for generations. The disappearances were not accidents or crimes of opportunity. They were offerings, sacrifices to something far older and more malevolent than I had ever imagined. And the worst part? There was nothing I could do to stop it. As Halloween approaches again, I'm left with the terrible knowledge that this year will be no different. The figures in the shadows are still out there, waiting for their next victims. All I can do is warn others, to tell them what I've discovered in the hope that they will keep their children safe. But deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before the cycle begins again and more children vanish into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but a growing fear and the echoes of a town's dark past. I had been hearing those noises for weeks, strange, unsettling sounds that seeped through the walls of Mr. Jenkins' house and into my nightmares. At first, I tried to brush them off as nothing more than my imagination running wild. After all, the old man was reclusive, but not known for anything sinister. But the longer I listened, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was late one night, and the noises had reached a crescendo. There were no more excuses left. I couldn't just ignore it any longer. I steeled myself, knowing that this could be dangerous, even life-threatening. With a sense of grim determination, I decided to break into Mr. Jenkins' house. I had to know what was behind those walls, What was making those noises that crept into my thoughts and made sleep impossible? The house was exactly as I remembered, old, dilapidated, and shrouded in an oppressive gloom. I approached the back entrance, the one I'd seen Mr. Jenkins use occasionally. My heart raced as I pried open a window. The air inside was thick and musty, and I had to fight the urge to turn back as I squeezed through. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by an overpowering stench, a mix of decay and something far more nauseating. It was as if the house itself was exhaling a long-held breath of rot and filth. I fumbled for my flashlight, the weak beam of light cutting through the darkness and revealing a chaotic scene of clutter. Old furniture was piled haphazardly, and broken trinkets lay scattered across the floor, their shadows casting eerie shapes on the walls. Every step I took seemed to amplify the foreboding that weighed heavily on my chest. I moved cautiously through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Dust-covered furniture, moldy curtains, and the occasional broken mirror only added to the sense of unease. But it was the sounds, the faint cries and whispers, that guided me deeper into the house, pulling me towards the basement. I reached the basement door, its heavy wood appearing ancient and foreboding. The sounds from below were clearer now, a series of soft, mournful cries that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated, my hand trembling as it hovered over the doorknob. The dread settled in my stomach like a lead weight, making it almost impossible to breathe. With a final gulp of air, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the silent house. I descended the stairs slowly, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. The basement was shrouded in near-total darkness, save for the feeble light from my flashlight. As I reached the bottom, the sounds became clearer, more distinct. Whispers mingled with what seemed like muffled cries. I knew, even before I saw it, that what awaited me was far more horrifying than I could ever imagine. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth behind the terrifying sounds that had invaded my life. The basement was cold and musty, the kind of chill that seemed to seep into your bones. I swept my flashlight across the room, and that's when I saw it, a scene so grotesque it felt like a nightmare come to life. There, in the dim light, were child-sized mannequins arranged around a dusty, cobweb-covered table. Each mannequin was dressed in the exact costumes of the missing children. I could see pirate hats, fairy wings, and superhero masks, all meticulously placed as if they were preparing for some macabre party. As I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest, the horrifying truth began to unfold. These weren't mannequins at all. The lifelike details, the small, delicate features, the costumes were fitted too perfectly, the limbs too real. It became sickeningly clear that these were not mere figures of cloth and plastic. They were the missing children, preserved in some twisted, unnatural way. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt bile rising in my throat. Panic surged through me as my mind raced. I had to get out of there. I spun around, my legs trembling, but just then, a sound froze me in place, a creak from behind. I turned slowly, and there he was, Mr. Jenkins. His face was pale, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. He had been watching me all along, lurking in the shadows. A surge of adrenaline propelled me into a desperate struggle for escape. I bolted for the stairs, but the fear-driven adrenaline made my movements clumsy. Mr. Jenkins was quick, blocking the way and reaching for me with a cold, gnarled hand. I shoved him aside, scrambling up the stairs with every ounce of strength I had left. My mind was a blur of terror as I crashed through the basement door and stumbled into the main level. I didn't stop to look back. I dashed through the house, crashing into furniture and barely registering the pain. Finally, I burst through the front door and into the night, screaming for help as I ran down the street. The cold air hit my face, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the house, and I kept running until I reached the safety of the streetlights and the distant sound of sirens. The police arrived within minutes, drawn by my frantic cries. They stormed the house, and what they found confirmed my worst fears. The entire community was soon engulfed in shock and horror as the extent of Mr. Jenkins' twisted secret life came to light. The house was filled with evidence of his macabre activities, and the truth about the missing children was finally revealed. As the days passed and the community grappled with the shock, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the horror we had just uncovered. The real monster hadn't been hiding in the dark corners of our town. It had been there all along, disguised as a harmless old man living alone. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying horrors are the ones that seem most familiar, lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life.